All right, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all. Greetings. And I will just say, just to be absolutely clear, right, the exits are here, the back, and over here. But this is going to be such a tremendous event. I'm sure no one will be exiting early. My name is Susie Clark, and I'm the director of the Mahindra Humanities Center, and it's really wonderful to see so many of you here today. And it's my great honor to say a few words of introduction. So first of all, the Charles Eliot Norton Professorship in Poetry was established in 1925, so we're in the 100th year. And its distinguished lecture series has witnessed a century of individuals delivering lectures on literature, music, and the visual arts. The most recent set of lectures was given by Viet Thanh Nguyen, who's here, on To Save and to Destroy, on Writing as an Other, and he delivered those lectures in 2023 to 2024, and his volume is already out, so congratulations to him. Here it is. And we are about to embark on this year's lectures given by Steve McQueen under the title Pulse. And the first lecture is on September 30th at 6 p.m. In Sanders Theater, so do join us for that. But today we are here to celebrate the centenary with a retrospective look at an exquisite collection of 5 books that has arisen out of past lectures, and to celebrate the partnership with Harvard University Press, the publisher of the lectures, which ensures that these lectures endure. Harvard University Press has made a centenary edition of 5 books, which is why we are here today. And these are the brainchild of Sharmila Sen, who is the editorial director and director of special initiatives at Harvard University Press. She was also instrumental in putting together tonight's event, and during every conversation we had about today's event, she's just demonstrated an infectious enthusiasm not only for the original 5 Norton professors celebrated through these special centenary volumes, but also for the incredible team she put together to write the forewords. And we have some of those panelists here today. So thank you to Sharmila Sen. And I would also like to thank George Andreu, the director of Harvard University Press, and Stephanie Kloss, the director of digital strategy. We have also another wonderful partnership here today, and that is the Harvard bookstore has joined us to sell copies of these books. You no doubt encountered them on the way in. Now, the official publication date is actually in a few days' time or next week, September 16th. So please take the opportunity to get your books before anyone else does. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce the books and those who wrote the forewords. I'm going to do the introduction to give you a flavor of the history in the order in which the Norton lectures were delivered. So we start with 1939 to 1940, when Igor Stravinsky delivered his lectures, and they are called Poetics of Music in the form of 6 lessons. The foreword is written by Vijay Iyer, who's here, who is the Franklin D. and Florence Rosenblatt Professor of the Arts here at Harvard University, with appointments in music and African American studies. Vijay has released 28 albums and is a Grammy-nominated composer, pianist, and musicologist. He was the recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship in 2013, a Doris Duke Performing Artist Award, and has been voted Jazz Artist of the Year by Downbeat Magazine no fewer than 4 times. So, Stravinsky. Our next book, chronologically, is by Ben Shahn, who delivered The Shape of Content in 1956 to 57. The foreword is written by Adam Gopnik, who is a staff writer at The New Yorker. He served as The New Yorker's art critic from 1987 to 1995, and he is a New York Times best-selling author of 10 books across numerous genres, including essay collections, the adventure novel, the children's novel, and indeed, he is a virtuoso of introductions to new editions, having written some for new editions of works by Maupassant, Balzac, Proust, Victor Hugo, and Alain Fournier. You'll notice a Parisian or French theme in those. So, then Shahn. The next, in 1967 to 68, Jorge Luis Borges delivered his lectures, This Craft of Verse. The foreword is written by Viet Thanh Nguyen. And of course, I've actually already told you the most special thing about his biography, namely that he was the Norton Professor in 2023 to 24. He's also the Errol Arnold Chair of English and Professor of English and American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California. His debut novel, The Sympathizer, won a Pulitzer Prize, and amongst numerous other awards, he was a recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship in 2017. So, Borges. Next, John Ashbery gave his lectures called Other Traditions during the academic year 1989 to 90. And the foreword is written by Stephanie Burt, who is the Donald P. and Catherine B. Locher Professor of English at Harvard University. Stephanie Burt is a prize-winning author of 14 books of poetry and literary criticism. She has written for all major magazines, including The New Yorker, the New York Times Book Review, Poetry Review, Slate, the Times Literary Supplement, the London Review of Books, and the Yale Review, and the Boston Review. So, John Ashbery. For those of you who are good at counting to 5, you will notice we have 4 panelists, a moderator, and somebody is missing. There's another volume, Umberto Eco, 6 Walks in the Fictional Woods, and he delivered these lectures in 1992 to 1993. The foreword is by Louis Menand, who unfortunately is not able to join us today, but please give him a round of applause too for So the format today, after this introduction, is that we're going to have an evening of discussion, and then there will be time for you, our audience, to ask questions. When it comes to that moment, please raise your hand so we can see you, and we'll be bringing a mic so that everyone can hear your question. And to moderate the discussion, I'm also pleased to introduce Shahn Kelly, who is the Dean of Arts and Humanities and the Teresa G. and Ferdinand F. Martignetti Professor of Philosophy here at Harvard. So please join me in welcoming all of our panelists, our moderator, and thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Susie, for that amazing set of introductions. Can everyone hear me? Is it okay? Yeah, good. What an honor to sit up on the stage with this amazing group of people. I am a humble philosopher, as you heard, and these are incredible minds, and I'm so excited to be able to talk with you about the Norton Lectures, about the particular Norton Lectures that each of you wrote a foreword to, about your experience doing that. I'm going to confess at the start, this is unrehearsed. That's the way Vijay said it had to be, because he's an improviser. But I'm sure, I know that it's going to be exciting. And I want to start off with a kind of a general question. I'm going to maybe start at the far end there. But anyone, feel free to jump in. So let's start with the Norton Lectures themselves. how do you understand the history and the importance of the Norton Lectures? And in particular, what does the series mean to you, the series of lectures and the particular ones that you've been involved in?
Sorry.
Well, I'm over towards that end.
Right.
Sure.
Well, I had the privilege of giving the Norton Lectures, which I found to be a nerve-wracking experience, honestly. It was like the ultimate final exam for someone who's in academia. But, for me, I'd actually read some of these Norton Lectures before, notably Toni Morrison's, but I had never paid attention to the fact that they were Norton Lectures. So then for me to give the Norton Lectures, I had to go and investigate what the Norton Lectures actually was. So I have to admit that I was completely unaware of the historical significance of this. And for me, that was important because I'm a Vietnamese refugee. I come from a family who doesn't know of any of the honors and recognitions that I've been lucky enough to receive. They know Harvard because my brother went to Harvard as an undergraduate. And even back then in the early 1980s, as a Vietnamese refugee to get to Harvard was a huge deal, because we recognized that this was a moment of cultural accomplishment for us as Vietnamese people. And so for me, my relationship to the Norton Lectures is routed that way, through a relationship to the canon. That to enter Harvard is for a refugee or for an immigrant, move towards canonization, inclusion in this very symbolic institution. And then for me as a writer and as a scholar to be in the series, it's also then a moment of that canonization, which, academics are easily seduced by canonization. We're weak-kneed creatures in that regard. So it's not to deflate the importance of the series, but it is to recognize the cultural capital that's embedded in the Norton Lectures and what they represent. So for me to give the lectures was both an acknowledgement that, this is a significant accomplishment, but also I was like, as a refugee, I also have to approach the canon from the outside. And I have to be a little bit skeptical about what canonization means as well. And I think that sort of moment of tension and ambivalence in relationship to inclusion in the canon is really important, because a lot of the people who are included in the canon and in the Norton series are people who come from the outside. They're not necessarily people who've been lab grown by 3 generations of Harvard intellectuals or anything like that, but they're oftentimes people who have struggled with the very notion of culture and what it represents. Culture as a mode of artistic possibility, intellectual accomplishment, but culture as a mode of power. And I could never get away from that. And so my lectures have been very much about power. And the lectures that I've had the privilege of reading, I think, were always very cognizant of that dimension. But the power of art, and that's which has seduced so many of us, but also the power of art in relationship to power in general. And Borges talks about the power of poetry in such a seductive fashion. But I read Czesław Miłosz as well, and Miłosz was talking about being, a young poet in Paris in the 1950s or 60s. And for him, Paris was not simply the city of light. Paris was a city of refugees.
Yeah.
Where people from all over the French Empire had come for ambivalent reasons. Yeah. And this was a formative moment for him. And I identify with that so strongly. And that in the end, to me, is what gives the Norton series its significance, is our recognition of the multivalent nature of the power of art.
That's so interesting. And I'm just always conscious of the fact that there might be students in the room. I hope there are students in the room. Excellent. Here's a couple. And I think every Harvard student, almost every Harvard student, will recognize that sense of now belonging to a thing that you've been outside of and not feeling comfortable being inside of it, and sort of navigating what it's like to be included and excluded simultaneously. But it's very powerful, I can see, in your particular experience with the Norton Lectures. Anyone else want to add to the story about what the Norton Lectures are, what role they play? Yeah, Vijay, go ahead.
Well, I guess I have a few different ways into it. When I first arrived here at Harvard as a faculty member in January of 2014, that was the spring that Herbie Hancock delivered the Norton Lectures, which itself felt like a kind of incursion of a very different sensibility into this world. And we could feel that in the room in terms of who was present, who showed up, and in that moment in 2014, it felt kind of radically new, that this was a very different kind of presence. And that mattered to me a lot. And I had the honor of getting to introduce one of those lectures, and this was my lifelong idol. I've listened nonstop to this man since I was 11 years old and tried to sound like him. And he still sounds as great today, by the way, at 85, as he ever did. Like, he sounds as good as he did 50 years ago, which makes no sense to me. But that was an event. And then, over the years that I've been here, Toni Morrison and Laurie Anderson, two also like lifelong kind of touchstones for me. And I guess the other point of reference that I had before I arrived here was Leonard Bernstein and his very, celebrated and legendary lectures, which you can find online, that, spoke to a very different sensibility and what felt more like a kind of old world sensibility of continuity with Europe. And what I experienced writing this introduction for Stravinsky, particularly because of when it happens in his life, which is the moment that he arrives on these shores, in fact, and becomes an American. It's that year that he did this. So this was sort of like his point of arrival. And so thinking of him as a diasporan, actually, which was also an interesting way to understand him even in Paris as a Russian emigre, and being a Russian presence, and his most famous period of work that people still refer to as his like sort of central works, even though they were at the beginning of his career, like Rite of Spring, Petrushka, and Firebird. Those are all his sort of like Russian period works from pre-World War I. And, a quarter century later, he arrives here fleeing war-torn Europe and doesn't know that he's about to have this life as an American icon for 30 more years. And so it's at this really interesting moment where he's trying to plant a flag in a way. And so I guess I'm trying to pick up on the theme that Viet more eloquently introduced, which is this kind of canon formation and also a kind of sense of incursion, maybe, into what is a pre-established canon. So I think this is something that happens as part of the American story and part of maybe Harvard story over the last 100 years. And maybe even this particular decade that I've been here, which I am hesitant to call the DEI interregnum, but maybe that's the way we should think about it, as a moment when, for example, Black lives have mattered. And, we hope that continues, but this is a moment where everything is in question now. So anyway, it's been an interesting moment to be a part of this story.
Yeah. And, amazing. Thank you, Vijay. Adam, the Norton Lectures, what are they? What have they meant to you?
I see them in a weird way, in a slightly more technical way, as somebody who spends a lot of time out on the road giving lectures, right? We refer to that in our family as the permanent tuition tour. Bob Dylan and I think, have been out on the road longer than any other two Americans, going from Tulsa to Philadelphia, doing our thing. I am the Willie Loman of American letters. And one of the things you learn when you lecture, and it's fascinating to see it reflected in the Nortons, is that the ostensible intellectual content of a lecture is extremely hard to put over if there's any kind of complexity to the argument at all. Because rhetoric is a poor way of communicating ideas, though it's the kind of default way human beings have been doing it. But what you do learn is that though it's very improbable that you can communicate a complicated idea to a large audience, you can communicate a passionate emotion very, very well. People will leave and you'll give them, if you could, give them a pop quiz, and they'll have absolutely no idea what the case was you were making. But what you were passionate about and what you were enthusiastic about, they always exit knowing. And so one of the things that fascinates me about reading the lectures is how much, in exactly that classic theatrical way, the subtext of the lectures is even clearer often than the text is. So with the Ben Shahn lectures, well, the Bernstein lectures, which were life-changing for me, in part because Bernstein mentioned my mom which will always warm up any boy's heart.
Depends on how he's mentioned.
But those lectures are very much, though they're ostensibly about the relationship between language and music and about the great unanswered question, is there a universal vernacular of music, are also partly Bernstein trying to justify his own activity, it seems to me, as a tonal composer and as a music maker, as a melody maker in a time that didn't shine on that necessarily. And that's very strongly the subtext of those lectures, the emotional part the audience will get. In the Ben Shahn lectures, which I had the privilege of writing about, you feel the same thing. They're ostensibly about the role of the artist in the university, a more tedious subject it is impossible to imagine. But the actual subject of the lectures is Ben Shahn's enormous feelings of confusion and rejection, because the kind of social realism that he had practiced in the 30s and 40s to great success and acclaim had been almost erased from the public record by the rise of abstract expressionism. And though he doesn't want to address that directly, that's the real emotional message. There's something to be said for subject matter. There's something to be said for social engagement. And the poignant courage with which he addresses that radiates through the lectures, even though there's nowhere in the tale is that the tale that he's telling. So for me, as a speaker, that's exactly what's fascinating about all the Nortons, that very complicated relation between the overt intellectual text and the very much more persuasive emotional subtext.
That's right.
Amazing. What a range of answers. This is fantastic. I can't wait to hear what you're going to say, Stephanie.
Since this is as we say in Radioland, an audio medium, and we're having a conversation, what I'd like to do is answer Adam and maybe also answer Viet, and then get to what I learned from Ashbery and what I've learned from thinking about lectures. What I hear you saying, Adam, is that not only does the subtext or the passionate singleness of what the speaker really wants you to come away with show up in hearing or reading them, which in this case is art is about stuff.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Genuinely abstract art is maybe a contradiction in terms.
Right.
But also the difference between Ben Shahn giving these lectures and, let's say, E.H. Gombrich writing Art and Illusion, which makes the same point in 10 times as many words, is that Gombrich is writing a book. It's a great book. I hope you all go read it. And Ben Shahn, who is famous as a graphic designer and an artist, not an art historian, is talking to people live who are sitting there and can get up and leave or take a nap. And this is a set of more or less durable intellectual achievements that are achievements of performance in an audio medium. Right? I listen to a lot of podcasts. I don't know if you do. The best podcasts, and this is why I prefer podcasts to audiobooks and reading books to audiobooks, and it's, audiobooks are real reading. That's fine if that's how you prefer to consume books. But I find that podcasts are wonderful because they take advantage of the medium, which is audio in time. And, I read pretty fast. That's one of the reasons I like my job. Reading is reading. It's words on a page. And these Norton lectures at their best have been lectures. And they look at the affordances and the limits of the lecture as a form. And that's why, to my mind, some of the most effective and influential lectures in the 100-year history of this prestigious series have been by musicians who are also working in an audio medium, whether or not they play clips. Which I guess brings us to canons. I hate that word, but we can't get away from it, right? If you're at Harvard, whether or not you feel you belong here, it's complicated. And those of us who have sometimes felt we belonged here have been absolute jerks if we didn't realize that many people come here thinking they don't, right? one of the things about Harvard is that it seems to be an instrument of canonization, whatever that means. Sometimes people face Harvard and they feel like something's being shot at them out of a cannon. Right? Sometimes, right, like, I don't know, people who've taken CS50. Sometimes people think that Harvard is like this priesthood who says, well, Ecclesiastes is in the Bible, but the book of Tobit's not. The Gospel of Thomas is not, but the Gospel of John is. That there is this canon, and Harvard decides what's whole. And no, that is not how artistic traditions, which to my mind are fundamentally secular, work. It's not, I think, how Stravinsky thought they worked. Mm-hmm. It's certainly not how Ashbery thought they worked. Artistic traditions are somebody I trust, for whatever reason, told me I would be a better writer or musician or person or have a better life if I read this or heard it or looked at it. So I'm going to go check them out and see if it's true. And if generation after generation that advice turns out to be valid, then we keep reading Proust or Paradise Lost. And if it's not, then we stop reading Congreve or name your favorite decanonized writer.
Has Congreve been decanonized?
Yes.
That's
Sorry
right.
to tell you.
Time to redecorate at home, I think. Yeah.
So what Harvard really is not, to my mind, an instrument of actual canonization in the arts, because actual canonization in the arts, unless you have a bizarrely religious conception of art, is not a thing. What Harvard is a megaphone. If I or Vijay or any of us just sort of show up in the street and say, Alan Peterson is a really good poet, and you should think about reading him. Or, what's another good example? The new Blood Orange album is really good. That's just me telling you what I like. But if I am teaching a seminar, which I love, or a lecture class, which I have mixed feelings about at this point, or writing in some venue that likes me more because I have a title, and I say, hey, the new Blood Orange record is pretty good. There's this band called Game Theory you should check out. Sarah Morgan Bryant Piat is one of the great poets of the 19th century. Go look at her. That's not anyone declaring somebody sacred. That's just somebody gave me a megaphone. And the megaphone is big and crimson, and it says Veritas on the side, and it means more people get to hear what I'm saying, which is great. If somebody hands you a megaphone, you've got something to say, take the megaphone. And the Norton lectures have been, over the years, an especially effective megaphone. And for Stravinsky, he used that megaphone to give not just an account of traditions of composed music, but an account of what Russia was, and what music as such was, and what art as such was, and why revolution is not a term of approbation. It's not for him. And John Ashbery, who Shamila and her colleagues, thank you, asked me to write about, Ashbery didn't want to tell you what art was. Ashbery wanted to tell you what some of his favorite artists were. And he loved that these were artists who were not famous, not canonical, not major, not trying to overthrow the past and establish a new tradition. They were just these weirdos. And Harvard handed him a giant megaphone, and he said, hey, go read John Clare, because you probably haven't. And it kind of worked.
Thank you, Stephanie. You have not disappointed. I appreciate it. But you raise an interesting point, and I want to sort of pivot a little bit from the question about the megaphone that Harvard is, or that the Norton lectures are, and the particular role that they play in our history and our culture. I want to talk about something more personal. So, as you say,
To you.
No to each of you. I don't care about me.
I care about you.
You're very kind. Thank you. No, but look, this is 100 years of Norton lectures. I think there are not quite 100 Norton lectures because there are some years in which there weren't lectures or they weren't published by Harvard, but that's a long time. And I think, the press, led by Sharmila and others, had this amazing idea to use this centennial to promote the idea of these lectures and some of the particular lectures. And they had to make a decision about which ones they were going to promote. They didn't choose Bernstein, for instance, but Stravinsky and many other choices that they did and didn't make. And they had to make a choice about who they wanted to introduce them. And they chose you guys. And the personal thing I want to get at is, what was it like for each of you to be asked to write about the figure you were being asked to write about? What was that like when you considered the possibility of writing about Stravinsky, of writing about Ashbery, and so on? But so I'll make this an opportunity for you to say a little bit about who you wrote about and a little bit about what your experience of doing that was. So maybe we'll start at the end again. Yeah.
So I wrote about Jorge Luis Borges, and the title of his lectures is This Craft of Verse. And I've read Borges, of course, and he's a huge figure in the field, whether he's canonized or not. I mean, I think he is. But
Yeah, sure.
the point was that it was really interesting receiving this because I, number one, am a failed poet. And I thought, why am I being asked to write about this craft of verse when I'm terrible at reading poetry? I'm terrible at studying poetry. I don't understand what poetry is. And reading Borges was actually really interesting because he's very well read. He cites a lot of things. He knows his literature. It was daunting to read this book. But at the same time, the question of emotion and the question that these were lectures and that they're in a humanities context was really important because, as learned as Borges was, his lectures were very definitely, eminently hearable, which was the medium, and readable, and not intimidating, I think. This is a huge accomplishment that I found in at least my favorite Norton lectures. The people who I really enjoyed reading took seriously this idea of the medium of this being a lecture and the idea that the audience really mattered, that they were not simply trying to speak to a narrow audience of specialists or tastemakers or professors. They were trying to speak to this kind of audience that spanned everybody from undergraduates to faculty to community members. And they took that idea very, very seriously. And so I think you're absolutely right that it wasn't only the content or the ideas, but it was the emotions that really drove this. And the Borges lectures were really interesting for me because, number one, they were very personal. This personal narrative is woven through it. And one of the most memorable moments in the lectures is when he talks about how he fell in love with poetry. He fell in love with poetry as a little boy, hearing his father read poetry out loud to him. And what Borges says about this is that his love for poetry began not intellectually, but emotionally. That he responded in this very emotional way to the poems, to his father, and that moved me so much. Not because I heard my father reading poetry, never would that happen, but my own relationship to poetry and literature is extremely emotional. That comes out of that experience of being a refugee boy in San Jose, California, and being saved from the refugee experience by literature, by reading. And to me, it was always very personal. And in fact, it made me remember that some of the things I fell in love with at a very young age was poetry. I would go and I would read the Romantic poets. Why would a young Vietnamese refugee boy read the same poets that Borges was listening to or reading? Like I was reading Byron and Keats and Shelley and so on, and just falling in love with the poetry. The moment I fell out of love with poetry was when I went to university. And I was taught by professors. And I thought, I'm too stupid for poetry. I don't understand what it is I'm being taught about the modernists, for example. And it would take me 30 years before I returned to poetry and discovered the kind of poetry I did respond to emotionally and viscerally in the same way that Borges is describing. Not necessarily the same poets, but one of the things I took away from this craft of verse was not, again, this idea of the canon or the whole history of poetry, but the emotional relationship to poetry that always drove Borges. And what I really got out of his lectures was the love for poetry as poems, as experience, as something intensely personal that was nevertheless at the same time something that could be shared as well. And one of the other claims that he made was that, and I think this is really true, we are readers first before we are writers, for those of us who are writers. Because I think he says very accurately, all writers are failed writers. Because this is true for me, all writers have this ideal in their minds of what they want to write, and I think all of us fail at that. But readers have the advantage, maybe not Stephanie, okay, but readers have the advantage that, everybody's a reader, and there's always a beautiful, perfect relationship between readers and what they read. And I feel that his book is really valuable for writers, but it's also incredibly valuable for readers. And I hope that when people read his book, what they take away from it, the first thing they should do, the first impulse they should have is to go out and read some more poetry and to forget the professors. And I'm a professor, so I'm telling you, forget the professors and what they say. Find the poems and the poets to which you just respond viscerally and emotionally. And that, I think, was a claim that he was making more than anything else in that book.
That's very powerful. Thank you, Viet. To have that experience, having to write about it, is pretty exciting. How about you, Vijay? Confronted with Stravinsky.
Yes, it's funny. As a composer, I often get invited to sort of comment on works of the past through my own work, like write a response to the Kreutzer Sonata, or in fact, one piece that I was asked to write that premiered in 2013 was a piece to commemorate the centennial of the premiere of Rite of Spring. So I've already been kind of like deeply engaged with at least early Stravinsky. And one thing that was really nice to remind myself of in the process was how beloved Stravinsky has been by Black American musicians and jazz musicians in particular. There's a famous anecdote about him showing up in a club where Charlie Parker was playing, and Charlie Parker finds out that he's in the audience, and he quotes Firebird in the middle of one of his solos, and Stravinsky just flips out and spills his drink and stuff. And then Alice Coltrane, the great pianist and spiritual guru and icon, recorded several works of Stravinsky and included them on her albums, including a large segment from Firebird and a large segment from Rite of Spring. And then most recently, Herbie Hancock himself, I think it was during the pandemic, he posted on Twitter this video of him, he said, people always ask me what my favorite piece of music was, and I can answer them in a second. It's Rite of Spring by Stravinsky. He said this, it makes me cry, and this was just like a few years ago he said this. So, he's been a really important, so Stravinsky himself as an artist, as a composer, as a creator, has been an important force in American music in a way that I'm not sure that doesn't often become part of the story about Stravinsky, And I wanted to think about why is that, I certainly studied his scores starting long ago, and particularly the piano-iness of it, like the piano reductions kind of lay bare the language of his music, which is very pianistic. So a pianist can just kind of step in and feel it out, and it feels like elemental in that way. And so I always had this kind of embodied relationship to his music because of all of this. And then, of course, it's the famous rhythmic sort of vitality in his music that is perhaps the most immediately identifiable characteristic of his work across his whole life. But then, what it is to be a composer is to sort of perform form, right? To perform formness or some formalism, right? To enact a sort of composerliness by saying, see, I put this together. I'm the mastermind behind this. And so there's a different impulse that's going on in the music that's sort of top down. So what I experienced as the pianist, as the sort of bottom up kind of embodied sort of blood and guts kind of part of it. And then there's this very cerebral part of it that's sort of about plotting out and permutations and these kinds of mathematical structures and things that you find in his work. And I have to say, I'm saying all of this because my experience of reading this text was a lot like that. And it kind of echoes what you were saying, which was that, and what you were just saying too, which is that there's an emotional core to any artist that, like, you have to be out of your mind to do this, actually. Like, you have to actually be obsessive, and you have to be really weird, like really an oddball to devote your life to making art. I mean, no one wants you to, you know? I can attest.
We want you to.
Okay, good, thanks. He's my divisional dean, so, you know.
Please keep making art. That's
so there's this kind of like, because of that, I think what comes out, I think, in all of these books is a kind of resistant energy where there's a kind of like, okay, I am this creator with this reputation, and I am presenting to you a certain kind of virtuosity of thought. But there's also this like very affective register of it all that's very like vulnerable and kind of tender. And that's the part that I think is also, it's in the subtext of Stravinsky. This like, it's very impassioned, these arguments he's making, and it's like he's trying to protect something that's very endangered almost, you know? So that's the argument that he's making, is that I know you guys want variety, and you want kind of like bells and whistles, and you want theatrics, and I'm here to tell you that's all the wrong way about it, right? You've read it, so you know that he's kind of like trying to make a case for control. Mm-hmm. And yet what comes through is a lot of heart in so doing. And that's what was interesting to me, that tension, which I think we all know.
That's amazing. How many of us are going home to listen to Rite of Spring? Thank you, Vijay. Adam, maybe you could even, for some of the audience who don't know who Ben Shahn is, maybe you could introduce him a little bit and then say something about what it was.
Sure. Well, I mean, the reason I agreed to do it was because a great writer once, when I was just starting off, kind of mentor, said to me, always say yes to everything, which is a good rule, actually, for writers, kind of a Zen rule. It's what John Updike, actually. And he meant it both as a joke, but also meant that the healthiest relationship for a writer to have with the world is to simply be in a perpetual state of affirmation, right? Everything is interesting, and there's something to be said about everything. Ben Shahn was particularly interesting to me. I said yes without thinking about it on Updikean Zen grounds. But it particularly touched me because it was very much part, not so much of my experience, but my father's experience. My father was one of those guys, talking about immigrant experience, who was, first generation Jewish kid, who came of age at a time in the 1930s and particularly in the 1940s when Ben Shahn really mattered. And then very much like so many young Jewish intellectuals of that time, then he got modernized. He went to university, college, and suddenly he got hit sideways with Henry James and Mark Rothko and all of that. Ben Shahn, regionalism, social realism was left behind. So when I mentioned to him, I'm going to write this introduction to Ben Shahn lectures, he's 90 now in California, he laughed, right? Because he had not thought about Ben Shahn since 1956 when he spoke. So there was something about that chemistry that appealed to me, and it's one of the things I wanted to write about. Ben Shahn appears in one of Woody Allen's movies, in Annie Hall, as a joke figure. Woody Allen says, "Oh, I know you went to socialist summer camp and have Ben Shahn etchings on the walls," and it's a way of placing a woman in this case in a particular context. So it fascinated me in that way, and I wanted to explore that side of it. And I think it's just always true about anything we write, that is we should say yes to everything, but then we have to find the thing inside ourselves that we are resonating positively to in that way. And let me say a few words about Congreve now, if I may. But in all seriousness, I love Congreve. I think The Way of the World is the best comedy, one of the two best comedies in English with Midsummer Night's Dream. But I'm saying it not to contest.
No,
the,
go for it. Go for it. You have a megaphone.
Yes, exactly. Which I don't normally have. I am anti-Harvardian. I am extraterrestrial to this place. Talking about canons and their weaknesses and so on too, and you feel this more strongly if you're not in a canon-generating place in that way. We all start with a canon we create ourselves, right?
Yeah.
That if we're passionate readers or listeners or observers, we all, by the time we get to whatever college it is, we have a canon already in our head, and it's always interestingly eccentric. Yeah. It's a bit of P.G. Wodehouse, a lot of Cole Porter, a touch of Mozart, and we bring it, and then we're stunned when we find out that that isn't everybody's common canon that's going to be validated. So whenever people talk about canons in that way, I'm always a little bit, not skeptical exactly, but I always turn to the notion that it's an inevitable function of being somebody who cares about not just the high arts, but the arts at all, right? You have those, violent quarrels in my generation about Led Zeppelin, Were Led Zeppelin a musical group or were they not? And it's in that way, forming canons and hierarchies of taste, I don't think that that's an infused activity that happens only in universities. It's kind of natural activity, which then gets refined or obscured or knocked down in a college.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you. Stephanie, I remember reading in your foreword that you were actually at the John Ashbery Norton lecture. So it must have been extraordinary for you in 1989, I think, is that right? It must have been extraordinary for you to get asked to write the foreword for those lectures.
I guess I was just glad that Sharmila asked me. I used to say yes to everything, and then I discovered I was sleeping 3 hours a night, and other people in my house were doing all the dishes, and that's not good.
Sleep 3 hours a night. So thank you. Yeah, unfortunately,
You get to do some of the dishes.
I do all the dishes
and
the cooking.
Then you're fine. Okay.
And the cooking.
Oh, good for you. Good for you. It turns out that you don't want me to do all your cooking. But yeah, so I try to say yes to most things at this point, but that was a very, very easy call, not just because it was Sharmila, not just because it was the Harvard press team, which I already had good feelings about, not just because it was John Ashbery, whose position with regard to various pieces of heavy artillery, cannons and otherwise, has been changing lately, and I got to write about that a little bit in my foreword, but because I was there. And it was John Ashbery saying, hey, if you want to write poetry that you are happy with, that other people might like, if you want to become the writer you want to become, you don't have to take as your formative figures the writers other people say are important. If you want to make rock music, you don't have to care about Led Zeppelin. Ashbery talks about having met O'Hara, and the first conversation they had was one of them saying to the other, I think Eric Satie is more important than Wagner. Which, if you know the history of composed music, you know how weird that is to say. And the Ashbery lectures, if you're a composed music person, are him giving you a bunch of Satiers and say, I know Wagner is Wagner, but that's not who's important to me. Right. Who's generative for me, who's important to me, is my personal, comic book collection. It's my personal set of favorite records. It's not the people, are there WHRB DJs in here? Anyone? Any radio people
There's
in
one
here?
One in the back, I see.
There's one, okay. Okay, so the Harvard radio station, if you don't know this, has for decades been organized where you have a whole bunch of people who are just nuts about obscure rock music and a whole bunch of other people who try to construct and reconstruct canons of hip-hop and a whole bunch of people who've been around for longer, since the beginning of FM radio, who try to get their favorite composed music on the air. This will come back to Norton lectures in a second, don't worry. I'm very much with Alex Ross, who has this great essay that says, I hate the term classical music, not the thing but the name. But it is called the Classical Music Department for historical reasons. And they specifically don't play Beethoven's Fifth. You can hear that on WCRB, you can hear that on other classical stations that play the things everybody else expects you to hear. And the composed music people over there down the street, they don't do that. They play, at this point, Matt Acoin, maybe, George Crumb, whoever else. And, a Baroque counterpoint you never heard of. But at the end of the semester, every semester, they have this 24-hour thing called the Warhorse Orgy, where they get out of the way, you know this, where they get out of the way all of the most famous pieces of composed music in the Western orchestral tradition, so that they say, yeah, we know those exist, but you know those. And Ashbery's Norton lectures, in a way, said, I think to me and to other people who were in the room, yeah, I know there are war horses, but that's not what's important to me. This is not the Warhorse Orgy. This is not Paradise Lost, as great and generative as Paradise Lost is, and it's certainly not Henry James, and it's not The Wasteland. These are the weird works of art that have been important to me. And I think for anyone who seriously wants to be either a real artist or honestly a real critic, you have to figure out what your personal weird comic book collection, what your programming, what's important to you looks like. And the greatness of the Ashbery Norton lectures for me when I was there, hearing him go on and on about Laura Riving, who I don't like, didn't work, or about John Clare, who did work, was these are these weird minor figures who matter to him. And it's not just that you get to Harvard or CCNY or not every artist goes to college, wherever you're going, and you bring your canon, you bring your comic book collection. It's that you as an artist, as a human who's listening, reading, painting, whatever, you are continually constructing and reconstructing your own set of works that are important. And it's honestly probably a bonus. It's probably helpful. It's probably generative. If those are not the same set of works that you're told are important or that have been important to everybody else.
It's absolutely true. When I think about Stephanie, every good graduate seminar I ever attended could have been called Weird Minor Figures Who Matter. And that's exactly what you want.
Or they could be weird takes on major figures that matter for
weird
reasons you
minor
didn't
takes
think they meant.
Weird Minor Figures Who Matter is incredibly rich fame.
Yeah. I mean, I have more fun writing about people where, like, maybe you've never heard of them often than writing about people I know are major. Like, there was about 10 minutes in the mid-'90s when I thought I was going to be a Miltonist, because Milton's great. But to really be a Miltonist, you have to read 10 languages, which I don't, and you have to have some confidence that you've got something to add to the tradition of smart people having things to say about Paradise Lost, and I'm not that smart. It's a lot more fun to say, hey, everybody, Raymond Roussel, as Ashbery says.
Yeah. Excellent, excellent. And I love the idea that part of all of our projects is to figure out who we are by figuring out what this weird personal canon of what we care about is.
Yeah.
Like, that's a kind of self-interpretation as much as anything else.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Listen, I have 5 questions prepared, and we've done 2 of them.
Lightning round.
And I'll do a lightning round, and then I'm going to open up for
30-second responses.
30-second responses. I'm going to hold you to it. Here is the question on the table. What is the one thing that you omitted from your foreword that you wish you had space to include? These forewords are like 3 pages long, by the way. I mean,
I'll throw.
Go ahead, yeah.
Ben Shahn had a very interesting relation as a book designer, a graphic illustrator. So he did the covers of all of S.J. Perlman's great collections in the 50s, and he had an enormous influence, therefore, on the young Andy Warhol, the Andy Warhol of the shoe and
You
fashion.
say that. That's in there.
What? Do I say that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, forget that. I must have put that. That's the problem with saying yes to everything. You forget what you wrote. Did I say that? Well, in that
You said
case,
the
there was
Andy
something else.
Warhol, yeah. I don't know if you said the shoe specifically.
Yes, I left the shoes out, and Warhol was. Thank God, I went on total. Oh, look at that! Look at that! I guess I put that in. Yeah, so
You got it
Never
all in
mind.
there. You got it all in there. Excellent. Vijay, yeah, you look like
it's
you've got it.
I don't know. It's a tough one. I mean, I think probably what I didn't say, but maybe was in my subtext, is that it's kind of hard to read. And it's partly because that's not what Stravinsky was good at. And in fact, I mean, what I did say, which is true, is that it was kind of ghost-written. Not entirely, but it was written in collaboration with a couple of his acolytes.
with Robert Kraft and.
Not Kraft, but actually this other, I forget the name of the one who was it, because it was actually delivered in French. And so there was somebody who was one of his students who translated it into French for him and kind of maybe helped him say certain things, put things into words. But there's another who's a Russian music theorist and philosopher named Suvchitsky, I think is the name, I might be mispronouncing it, whose ideas are kind of present throughout. And I think whose style of sentence craft is kind of like part of what makes it a little thick to read, which isn't, and I guess I'm saying this because I didn't want to say, actually, this is kind of boring. It's not that it's boring, but that it's like a little slow going because this wasn't really
His thing. Yeah.
and it's like, what's interesting to me is that all of this is like artist discourse, which is not generally something we study, oddly enough. We should. I always advocate for it, and I think we're all kind of examples of it at some level. But it's not really, you don't often have a public lecture by an artist in an academic institution. And so that's one of the peculiar, unique and slightly troubled, let's say, aspects of the entire Norton series, which is that these are artists speaking from the heart and with passion and with also a kind of sometimes awkward formalism about what they do.
And I'll jump on here and say the one thing I probably should have mentioned is Borges delivered his lectures without notes. I mean, he just spoke them. And it took, I think, 20 or 30 years or more to publish his lectures because I guess the tapes were lost. Or they were just buried in an archive somewhere. And, it's incredibly hard to give an hour lecture with a script versus...
He was blind at that point. He was blind at that point already.
Yeah. But, have you ever tried to give a lecture for an hour without notes?
Yes.
That speaks yes, but it speaks purely to the impression of the medium that you brought up, Stephanie. He really inhabited that idea of the lecture and the mode of the bard and delivered it purely in an oral fashion.
Yeah, excellent.
I failed, by the way.
Did you leave anything out of your foreword, Stephanie?
I don't know. Auden, maybe? The figure of Auden is all over Ashbery's thinking about what it means to work in an artistic tradition. Ashbery also possibly turns it into an autistic tradition. That is a book that someone needs to write. And it's one of the differences between Ashbery and Auden is that Ashbery is so inward-turned and so concerned with the idea that maybe no one else will ever understand what he says and that he's talking to himself, and he's fundamentally a lonely writer in a way that I think Auden was not. The other thing that I didn't get to say, and the introduction was not the place for it, but we're talking about a lot of dudes.
Yep.
A lot of dudes here, right? I don't know when the first woman gave a Norton lecture.
When was it? Yeah.
I should have looked it up on my way here. But rereading the Ashbery, I had a false memory, a ghost memory that he'd given a lecture on Stein because I was making my way through Stein, who I knew was important to Ashbery, around the same time I was going to the lectures, and I sort of made up this thing that never happened, right? But the only woman who he tells everybody to go read is Laura Riding, who was notable in any context, whatever the genders of the people in that context, for her unrelenting assertions of her unparalleled authority over everything.
Especially other poets.
Well, yeah. But there's something about Ashbery just sort of wandering on stage and saying, well, I'm going to talk to you about my favorite things, not the song, and here you are, and I'm just going to go on, that suggests that he expected that people would listen, and that the people there didn't have other things or people competing for their time. And looking again at those lectures, I think about the assumption that Ashbery or that John Wheelwright or that Laura Riding sort of has a claim on your time just because they are who they are. And it's an assumption that John Clare, who Ashbery writes about, did not share. And I think it's an assumption that has to do with life experience and how old you are and what's happened to you. And it also has something to do with how you grew up and what your pronouns are. And I don't regret not putting that in the introduction. It would have been a distraction in some ways from the things that are wonderful about this book, which I hope you all go home and read. But it is something that I wanted to bring up if nobody else did, tonight.
Fascinating. Thank you for that, Stephanie. That's amazing. Well, we do have some time for questions. I just want to pause and thank our speakers for the moment. Really good.
John, what were your other two questions?
I'll tell you afterwards.
Okay.
I have not been disappointed, and I hope you haven't either. So we do have time for a couple of questions from the audience. We're going to close right around 7:30. There's a question up here, and there's Mary, I think, has a microphone, or someone has a microphone.
I have the answer to the mystery. So the first
good.
woman to give a Norton lecture was Helen Gardner in 1979 to 80, and the topic was In Defense of the Imagination.
Wow. Great topic. Excellent.
Late date.
Okay. Late breaking news. Okay, so there's a question right here.
Thank you. It's incredible to hear from such a successful group of people. However, I'm more interested in the other side of the story. So what were the greatest obstacles and or greatest failures that you experienced in your life, and what lessons did you learn from those moments that helped you catapult to where you currently are today? And if you don't want to reminisce on your failures, you can just talk about the lessons, and that's also great too.
Good question.
Who wants to dive into this one? Sure, we all.
Mine's really short. I tried for a few years to be a dad. That sucked. I was bad at it. Now I love being a mom.
Excellent.
I write about that. That's the basis for my art.
Let me sublimate the question into the text that I annotated. One of the things that's moving about Ben Shahn's lectures, which, as I say, are where the whole emotional subtext is, why are people ignoring the work I do when the work I do is so deeply rooted in exactly what it is that art ought to do, is a reminder of the fact that no judgment is ever complete, no verdict is ever wholly in. Ben Shahn now plays a role. There's an exhibition of his stuff at the Jewish Museum in New York right now that's recirculating in that way. So I think that the greatest wisdom that one can learn painfully over time is exactly that the story is never closed and the story is never finished. And that if you're committed to doing, as Salinger says, to writing with all your stars out, or painting, or making music, that you are never a failure in that way. It's not possible to be in an ultimate existential sense.
Love that.
Yeah, that reminds me of something that one of my dear colleagues and mentors, the great trumpet player Wadada Leo Smith, experimental musician and composer, we had him here as a visiting professor a year or so ago. I think it was spring of 24. And I remember a student asked him a similar question. And he said, well, think of it this way. The greatest success that every human being has is being born. And so you should embrace that success as all that you need to carry on in the world and go meet other people who are also born and also successful and pick it up from there, which to me is, that's such a beautiful response to a question like that.
You said that again?
I'm paraphrasing. What I will do is direct you to, I think the student actually posted this on Instagram.
Okay.
So I'll share it with you.
Be with the born. I like that as a
Yes.
motto too.
Yes, that's right. Born and successful.
Be
Also
with the
born, also successful. The other thing I wanted to say is that when I was in college, I was a physics and math major. And it's not that I failed, but I succeeded in finding a path that I loved. And that was the true success, which came quite late. I didn't even make the switch until I was 23. So you still have time.
Well, my brother was accepted by Harvard, and I was not. My parents weren't happy with that. And then to compound things, I decided to become a writer, whereas my brother did the right thing, which was become a doctor. But I decided to become a writer, and I spent, 20, 30 years feeling like I was a failure as a writer. And ironically, when I embraced the failure, when I embraced the fact that I would never be published, that actually was the opening for me. You too, right? Like the idea that somehow I was, going back to the idea of the canon, and I don't endorse the idea of the canon. It's simply that I recognize that I'm a deeply flawed human being, and that I like the things that I'm supposed to like. I should get into Harvard. I should be published, But when I gave up those things, and when I embraced being a failure and I embraced being minor, that was actually important for me because it freed me.
Yeah.
To write exactly the way I wanted to write.
That's right.
Not to write for other people, not to write for institutions, not to write for acceptance or success or anything like that. And so, there's ways in which being a failure, as your question is implying, is actually enormously powerful if we're willing to embrace that.
Fantastic. We have time for one last question. Do I see a hand up somewhere? Yeah, okay, perfect. Right. Just pass it down.
Thank you so much for the talk. I'm a student here. I study literature and I work at the Goldier Poetry Bookshop down the street. Yeah. Borges, when he was here doing the lecture, used to spend days sitting at the bookshop and talk to students in between classes because he was blind. He would sit on the sofa and kind of hang out. And now that is a different way of learning through talking, through conversation. And lecture is a different mode to that. I'm very touched that everybody here, I see a lot of faces who are not students, who are kind of just in the public, coming to these lectures. And I see every year, in the past year, I went to the lecture, I see a lot of people who are not students. And I think that's very interesting. And Stephanie, you kind of touch on that about it is such a valuable thing that people actually spend time where there are other competing things of our attention to go to these lectures and to hear and listen to the artists and the intellectuals. What does that mean in today's kind of, when we have such a kind of crazy attention economy? And what does it mean to have a lecture that is open to the public and have people go there and listen?
Excellent. Yeah. Great question. Yeah, about the Norton Lectures, again, it brings us full circle to the first question, but now focused on the fact that it's a way of bringing together a community of people who aren't necessarily just part of Harvard, but are broader, and they're brought together by their love of the arts and by their love of making things and making music and painting and poetry. What do you guys say about that? What does that feel like to you?
At the risk of sounding a little sermonizing, but I will risk it. We live at a moment of unique political and social crisis, it seems to me. We can't evade it. in any way. What we can remind ourselves of is that a healthy democracy, however limited and imperfect, depends, yes, on the rule of law and free and fair elections, but it depends just as much on having a flourishing, pluralistic culture. And the idea that you have lectures on subjects that may at times seem esoteric, that are open to the public, that's a simple idea of incredible value. I always feel that way when I walk into the New York Public Library. I can walk in here and ask to see a book simply by the fact of my own existence. We take it for granted, as we take for granted the idea that the Norton Lectures are open of necessity to the public, but that's an accomplishment that it's taken thousands of years for human beings to achieve and fulfill, and it's incredibly fragile. So when I look at the Norton Lectures and think about them, I think about the power and fragility of pluralistic culture, and I think we have to be more committed to it now than we've ever been in our lives.
Wow. If anyone wants to add to that, yeah. No, that's amazing. Thank you.
What I wanted to add is that public events at Harvard or at an institution like it are moments when the institution can learn something new about its place in the world. And, they don't always know, when I say they, I mean, let's say the powers that be, I don't know, the people who make these decisions about whom to bring in. They don't always know what they're getting into because artists' lives are public in a way that professors' lives aren't. We're constantly in conversation with all kinds of folks. I live in New York City, and I remember the previous director of Mahindra Center, Homi Bhabha. I got to know him when I first came here, and he was like my mother's generation, also from Mumbai, so he became like kind of avuncular in the way he dealt with me. So then I saw him some years later, and he's like, "How's it going? Are you still living in New York?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm still making the community." He said, "Good, because nothing interesting ever happens here. New York is where everything, And he's like, "You just see the same people over and over, I don't know if he's in the room or if I'm now like sentencing him to some kind of hard labor or something. But anyway, which is to say that there is a sort of insularity that happens in the institution. And when a moment like Herbie Hancock giving the Norton Lectures happens, it's kind of like the floodgates open and Harvard learns something new about the world, and new relationships are formed, new truths are revealed or hidden truths are revealed. And that to me is what's important about all of these, about the Norton Lectures, is like an artist has reach that an academic does not have. And that's why it matters to bring artists into the institution, because everything they do has an immeasurable impact.
I remember I was having an appointment with my ophthalmologist, and he said, "What are you going to do right now?" And we were just making conversation. I said, I'm about to go give these Norton Lectures. And he said, "What are they about?" I said, "Writing as an other." And his face just sort of went blank. He said, "What does that mean?" And I thought it was very obvious, but I was like, "No, what does that mean?" And an ophthalmologist appointment is not really the right moment to get into this, but it was always, that's a reminder of the importance of the audience and the fact that the audience, you cannot assume that the audience is homogenous. You cannot assume that the audience is going to all be people doing the arts and so on and so forth, but you have to have faith that the art or the ideas or the humanities can in fact actually reach people and touch them no matter their background. And that is true when you bring people into Harvard, obviously, but as someone who does give a lot of lectures, I'm on the lecture circuit too, and I give all kinds of lectures, and I also give lectures at my university. I teach a large lecture course on the Vietnam War, and almost none of my students are humanities students. And I feel that in that space, it's my obligation not simply to lecture, but to perform. Mm-hmm. Because part of what's happening here for me as a lecturer, and going to the emotional dimension, is the idea that lectures are democratic. We are trying to speak to a large audience of people who are not the same. And we have to have faith in what it is that we believe in, everything that you said, Adam, and that we have to have the passion and the eloquence to convey that love of what we do to a very diverse audience. And I really believe it can be done. Because the last great pedagogical experience I had with a lecture was not at Harvard, but was in fact at San Quentin Prison, where I went a few months ago. And that was one of the most moving experiences I've ever had, talking to, they were all men who had been in many ways classified and treated as others, and who had done terrible things, and who were struggling to recognize what they had done, and who had come to a talk about otherness and about books. And signing their books was probably the most moving experience I'd ever had in a book signing line. So I appreciate the example you gave of Borges sitting outside a bookstore just willing to talk to anybody, because I think that is the obligation for those of us who believe in the arts and the ideas and humanities. It's for everybody. It's not just for the coterie, but it's for everybody. We believe that, and it's up to us to convey that through things like these Norton lectures.
Amazing.
Thank you.
Yep, do you want to say something?
Oh, I mean, I can't add to that. Yes. I have more thoughts about the history of the lecture in New England and about whether everything really is happening in New York. No, things happen elsewhere. New York's great. I used to live there. But there's things. Art can come from anywhere. You can make art anywhere, and you're going to make more interesting art if you look for art by and about and for people who aren't like you.
Here, here.
That's it.
That's right.
Well, I want to thank our panelists especially, and I want to thank Sharmila and the Harvard University Press for putting together this amazing set of centennial lectures. I want to thank all of you for coming. And I want to thank the Harvard Bookstore, who I believe is still out in the foyer there, for hosting the book sale this evening. You can stop by on your way out and buy some books. Also, I want to announce and invite you all to this year's Norton Lectures. They'll be given by the filmmaker and artist Steve McQueen. The first one will be on September 30th in Sanders Theater. Thank you all for coming. Thanks again for our panelists.